Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I welcome you to our America at a Crossroads program. And of course, we welcome our guest, Ambassador Dennis Ross, and our honored moderator, Madeleine Brand. We thank them both for making themselves available to us on 3 days' notice for this important briefing, which has attracted in the last 3 days almost 6,000 registrants. As we shared last night during our program with Speaker Pelosi, we are all horrified and grief-stricken by the events of the past several days. We are grateful for the tremendous support and the words of President Biden and other American diplomats and officials, and pray for the safety of our sisters and brothers during these very dark, threatening, solemn, and somber times. Again, tonight, we will be providing a link in the email we send right after tonight's program for those who would like to donate to the Israel Emergency Fund. Excuse me. 100% of all donations to this fund will be going directly to where the funds are needed most in Israel. Of course, you can go to the website of your own favorite Jewish organization or synagogue and find donation links there as well. As we brace for what will surely be a complicated and emotional week, we nevertheless wanted to remind you that next week on October 18th, we welcome Adam Nagorny of the New York Times in conversation with Pat Morrison. He covered the 2020 presidential race for the New York Times and is the author of a new book about the New York Times, Scandal, Scorn, and Transformation of Journalism. That's next Wednesday at 5 o'clock. Now for more program highlights, my colleague, David Lair, who is celebrating his birthday today. Happy birthday, David.
Thank you. Tough times to have a happy occasion. Thank you, Janice. Welcome to America at a Crossroads. For those of you who missed last night's program with Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, it was extraordinary, and I urge you to view it on YouTube where all our programs can be seen. For us at America at a Crossroads, the war in the Middle East is not only a major news issue, but it's also a personal one. I've been going to Israel to visit relatives for 60 years, from the time when oranges were more than 50% of Israel's exports, decades before the genius of Startup Nation made Israel into an economic force that powers economies around the world. It was a struggling country facing daunting odds. I went there in June 1967 when annihilation seemed likely as a result of the threats leading up to the Six-Day War. To witness the barbarity of the past weekend and the heartrending scenes has to affect any sentient human being. But even more so when you know that people who you knew as kids are in imminent danger. Great solace comes from having leaders in this country who are supportive in an unprecedented way, from President Biden to Secretary of State Blinken to National Security Advisor Sullivan to Secretary of Defense Austin. Their comments have been heartwarming and reassuring. Hearing from leaders and mavens helps us find our moorings and some optimism in difficult times. That makes our guest tonight so very important. He can offer a sane and sober analysis of what this tragedy means going forward. Thank you, Dennis, for joining us at a time when we know you are being pulled in countless directions and your expertise is viewed as invaluable and is clearly in demand. Just a brief note, upcoming programs after the ones that Janice cited. Neil Katyal, who'll be chatting with us with LAist Larry Mantle on Thursday, not our usual Wednesday, October 26th. And they'll also host David Leonhardt of the New York Times to discuss his soon-to-be published book, With Warren Only. David is a Pulitzer Prize winner who's written for the Times since 1999. It's now my pleasure to introduce a member of the Jews United Board, a veteran of decades as the leader of Los Angeles, as both an LA City Councilman and an LA County Supervisor, an invaluable member of the America at Crossroads team, Zev Yaroslavsky. Zev?
Thank you, David. Thank you, Janice and Mel and our whole team. For nearly 50 years, Ambassador Dennis Ross has had an unparalleled role in negotiating among the parties in the Middle East on behalf of several United States presidents. He is currently counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He also teaches at Georgetown University. Dennis was point man on the Middle East peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. He served 2.5 years as special assistant to President Obama. He was also the special advisor on Iran to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. And he successfully brokered the 1997 Hebron Accord, facilitated the 1994 Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty. It is undoubtedly safe to say that there is no one, perhaps with the exception of Henry Kissinger, who has had more experience dealing with this fraught political morass of the Middle East than Ambassador Dennis Ross. Tonight, he is the person we would want to offer wisdom and insights into what has been a very tragic set of events and what portends even more tragic events in the days ahead. He will be joined tonight by one of our regular hosts, KCRW's Madeleine Brand, a longtime and award-winning NPR broadcaster who has appeared numerous times on America at a Crossroads. Madeleine is the host of her daily NPR program, Press Play, which airs on Southern California's KCRW, and she hosts a podcast and she does a lot of other things. So let me turn it over to Madeleine and to Dennis.
Thank you, Zev, and thank you all for being here. And especially to you, Ambassador Ross. I know you must be very busy these days. And so thank you for taking the time to speak with us and answer our multiple questions. Before I get to policy questions in your analysis, I just want you to respond to, I guess, just how you're feeling about this as someone who has worked with numerous administrations on peace or the attempts at peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Looking at what's transpired over the past several days, how are you feeling about it?
Like everyone, I don't think you've had to be a negotiator for a long time, knowing all the parties there to feel a kind of revulsion, a sadness, a sense of madness over what has happened. This was Israel's darkest day ever. They suffered more deaths and casualties in one day than they had at any point in their entire history. You think about all the wars that Israel fought, 48, 56, 67, 73, 82, the conflicts with Hamas previously. Sorry. And one of the things that you see is that the casualties within Israel itself had never been like this. You have to go back to 1948 to see anything that even approaches what you're seeing here. And even then, the numbers, they were high over the course of that, but they don't approach what we've seen now. We already know there's 1,200 dead. We're talking about 3,000 wounded. I mean, the numbers are staggering and would be the equivalent. The number of deaths are the equivalent of more than 30,000 here. We suffered 3,200 on 9/11. When we say this is Israel's 9/11, it's actually worse than 9/11 because A, the numbers proportionally are much higher. B, it's ongoing. 9/11, it stopped. This is ongoing. And Israel is having to cope with this. I will say this, it is extraordinary to see the Israeli response. We had watched 40 weeks of demonstrations in Israel, which a grassroots movement that was a democracy movement that showed the depth of the Israeli ethos when it comes to democracy and the readiness to defend democracy. Those 40 weeks of demonstrations with, again, the equivalent of what would be millions of demonstrators here, sent a signal, I think, to Hezbollah and Hamas and Iran that maybe Israel was weak. And the irony is that as soon as this happened, we've seen an unbelievable coalescence. I can tell you, those reservists reporting exceed the numbers who have been called to come in to their units. There has never been this kind of a response to call-ups that we're seeing now. The people giving blood in Israel, if you see any of the pictures, people extend around blocks, people organizing food banks, people organizing because it turns out that some of the stocks of, believe it or not, vests, bulletproof vests, some of the equipment for the reservists, it seems remarkable, but there's shortages. And here again, you have Israelis from all walks of life suddenly chipping in because there's this sense of not just a shock, but an existential danger and wanting everyone to see in the face of this, everyone comes together. So I find at a certain level, I'm also see this reassuring and a source of inspiration, but it's impossible not to be deeply troubled. And you feel like you walk around with a constant weight on your shoulders.
Yeah. I want to get into the Israeli military response in a moment, but first, I want to get your assessment. Everybody has been wondering, and there probably won't be any definitive answers for a long time, maybe years from now, how this happened. How was it? How were they able to pretty much just bulldoze their way across a fence, launch from air, sea, and land this massive attack with no resistance from Israeli forces?
So it is a question that everybody's asking, and it seems incomprehensible. Absolutely, it seems incomprehensible. So let me try to explain the incomprehensible. First, there was a fundamental strategic surprise. In all cases of strategic surprise, whether it was 9/11, whether it was Pearl Harbor, whether it was the 1973 war, all the data or the indicators that you needed to be aware of were there. They were there in plain sight, but no one put them together. And no one put them together because there were a set of assumptions. And the assumptions created a kind of prism through which every factor that you saw was interpreted. So what were those assumptions? One, that Hamas, under the leadership in Gaza of Yahya Sinwar, had become increasingly concerned about trying to preserve an economic floor. And that economic floor was heavily influenced by the number of Palestinians from Gaza that Israel was letting in. Israel was letting in close to 20,000 workers a day. Each of those workers made 10 times what they could make if they were working in Gaza, if they could get a job at all, because there's 50% unemployment in Gaza. So number one, there was this reading that Hamas was determined to preserve that, and that meant, yeah, there could be some flare-ups, but there wasn't going to be any serious effort at a conflict. So that's number one. And number two, a couple of months ago, the Israelis succeeded in killing in the West Bank an Islamic Jihad commander. Islamic Jihad in Gaza fired rockets into Israel in response. The Israelis responded by killing the most important military commanders in Gaza of Islamic Jihad, and Hamas did nothing. This went on for 5 days, and Hamas did nothing. So it cemented in the eyes of the intelligence establishment, they really don't want to get into a conflict. On top of that, the last few weeks, there were demonstrations they organized in large numbers at the wall in Gaza, but that seemed to be a function of Qatar having cut the monies they were giving per month to Hamas in Gaza, and creating a sense of difficulty or the potential for a conflict or escalation triggered Qatar to come back in to provide the monies again. And it seemed to be also part of a Hamas effort to get Israel to allow more workers to come in. Now, what was happening at the same time they were having these demonstrations, they were throwing smoke grenades. And this was covering what in fact was being a kind of surveillance of where were the weakest possible places in the wall that made sense to breach. So there was a kind of deception campaign that Hamas was carrying on, and that contributed to the intelligence failure. But obviously, the intelligence failure is only part of the failure. The other failure was the absence of any real military presence down there. And that can be explained by two other factors. One, over the last couple of months, Hezbollah has engaged in a series of provocations on the border with Israel in the north. And it may well have been part of some kind of orchestration at deception. I'm not saying that Hezbollah for sure knew that Hamas was going to do what they did and when they did it, but I can imagine, especially because the Iranians had organized meetings in Lebanon with Hezbollah and Hamas and the Revolutionary Guard. I can well imagine that, Hamas was saying, look, we're going to do more, we're going to plan to do more, and it would be good for you to divert attention away by doing more here. And Hezbollah did. There's a green movement that's really a phony green movement. It is really a Hezbollah front group. And they set up towers and positions right along the border, right up next to the border between Lebanon and Israel. And these were kind of surveillance towers, and then they stocked them with weapons. And so that began to draw more Israeli attention. Then they set up, there's a blue line, which is the UN established something called the blue line It's in a no man's land, but the blue line is what the UN recognizes as the actual border between Lebanon and Israel. And they Hezbollah set up 2 tents on the Israeli side of the blue line. And Israel basically thought through diplomatic means to get them removed, which sent some interesting signals. A, that Israel really isn't looking for trouble also. It tended to cement the image that Israel with Hezbollah and Hamas is distracted because of what's going on domestically. On top of that, they fired anti-tank shells into Israel at one point, and they allowed Hamas to fire some rockets at one point. So Israel built up significantly its presence along the Lebanese border and in the West Bank because of acts of terror and violence, principally in the West Bank, but not exclusively. There were some terror acts in Israel itself. The daily shootings in the West Bank produced a very significant increase in the Israeli military presence in the West Bank. Israel does not have a large standing army, so the bulk of the military was suddenly put in the north and in the West Bank, and in a border where they didn't expect anything, and where they felt they had a barrier, and where they were convinced if something was going to happen, they would have intelligence early warning. They basically had bare bones. So all of this came together to produce what I call a perfect storm.
Yeah. And obviously it took a long time to plan this. This
Yeah.
was a very sophisticated operation. How long do you think roughly it took to plan?
I would say this was, for sure, it was, some say a year. I doubt that. I think this was probably 4 to 6 months in the planning stage. One reason, I just want to add one point here, because I know there was a Wall Street Journal article that said that, it was driven by Iran, gave them the green light. Was Iran encouraging Hamas to kill Israelis? Every single day. Were they providing funding and arms to Hamas? Absolutely. Has there been training? Yes. Did they create some coordination with Hezbollah? Yes. Were they orchestrating and planning this operation? I doubt it. And I'll give you a paradoxical reason for my doubt. Israel is so much more intelligent. It had so much more intelligence asset trained on Iran than it does on Hamas. Again, viewing Hamas as a different kind of threat. Israel would have picked up if Iran was really trying to orchestrate this. Israel would have picked that up. So I don't believe Iran played a kind of orchestrating role. I think Hamas was very good with their operational security, limiting who discussed anything. It still is surprising because they clearly rehearsed a lot of things. I mean, this was fully coordinated. They laid down a barrage of 3,000 rockets. It's like when you imagine when there are infantry assaults, you always create fire as a cover. They launched a barrage of 3,000 rockets, which created a cover for what they were doing at the border when they went ahead and breached it. There was a distraction because of that. They used bulldozers to break down the barrier, and then 1,000 to 1,100 Hamas fighters went through that breach. They were in pickup trucks. They were on motorcycles. Every pickup truck had a mounted machine gun, a heavy mounted machine gun. They had hang gliders that came in. They tried from the sea as well. So this was what is called in the military parlance, all domains, including cyber. There was some cyber attacks to try to disrupt Israeli communications. One other factor to keep in mind, there are more religious, observant Israeli officers now in the military than historically. This was not only Shabbat, it was Simchat Torah. Many of them did not have their phones on as a result. So again, the timing wasn't an accident. It's not the equivalent of Yom Kippur, but nonetheless, there was very slow reaction, partly because of what I just said. And there was also confusion.
There was also no pre-warning, no chatter picked up on from monitoring communications from Hamas and others.
Right.
None of that, no early warnings from anybody saying, hey, something big is happening. Bin Laden determined to attack, one of those?
The short answer is no. The Egyptians are saying there are different reports that the Egyptians did pass a warning that Hamas is up to something. It wasn't more detailed than that, but they said Hamas is up to something and you should be watching it. Now, did that warning, because it was vague. We went to the problem in the intelligence world is you get a vague warning and you're looking at everything else doesn't seem to fit it. So it tends to be treated as an outlier. Was it passed up the chain to the highest elements of the intelligence, military intelligence, and the political leadership? I don't know. I can tell you, look, there will be recriminations in Israel when this is over. Now's not the time for the recriminations, given the shock and given what is required. But this will be a lot like what happened after 73. The Argonaut Commission its findings came out in March. The war ended at the end of October. The findings came out in March. The recommendations of the Argonaut Commission was that the chief of staff of the military and the head of military intelligence resign. They didn't call for the political leadership, meaning Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan, who was defense minister, to resign. Tens of thousands of reservists came out in the street and demanded they resign. There will be recriminations here because the scope of this was so consequential and it was catastrophic in terms of its results. There will be, when all is said and done later on, there will be a different political reality in Israel.
How angry are people at Benjamin Netanyahu? And, I know this, as you're saying, this is not the time for recrimination, but I would like to get your analysis. You know Benjamin Netanyahu, you've worked with him. How much of this can be laid at his feet in terms of how he dealt with Hamas and his right-wing policies in Israel?
So I want to divide that into two parts. The Israeli position basically since 2009 has been consistent. So we had Hamas provoke attacks in the end of 2008, beginning of 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021. In 2016, 18, and 19, there were more limited skirmishes, exchange of rocket fire that went on for 24 to 36 hours, much different than the others I cited. There was this basic assumption that, okay, we can manage this with Hamas. It's a cost, but it's a manageable cost, and it's much less than the cost of going back into Gaza. So that set of assumptions has been operating since 2009 for 14 years. Yes, Prime Minister Netanyahu was the prime minister during all that time except for 1 year. That set of assumptions has now been shattered. So the whole approach to Israel is going to be different right now. They're not going to live with a threat from Hamas. Again, we can get into what that means. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is a sense that this was so catastrophic that there is a sense the government was responsible. There is a poll out now that shows that 94% of the Israeli government, this poll came out today, 94% of the Israeli government holds the government responsible for what happened. So you can ask about Prime Minister Netanyahu. My own sense is, in Israel, these kind of usually failures in war have real political consequences. This one will absolutely have political consequences. But as I said, there will come a time for that. It's not right now. We have a national emergency government that was just formed. It was formed exclusively to deal with this threat. One of the premises of it is not just that a war cabinet has been created, but one of the premises, one of the agreements was nothing other than dealing with the war is now on the table. So you don't have to say the judicial reform issue has been shelved for now. It obviously has been shelved for now. My guess is it's been shelved forever. And one of the reviews that will take place for sure, I didn't mention this in terms of the perfect storm, the military was dealing with a reservist issue. There were constant concerns about what it was doing to the fabric of the military. You had reservists who weren't showing up. You had those who were doing double duty to make up for it. So there was a distraction. It's almost impossible to say that the leadership of the military wasn't distracted given what was going on. So you have to factor that in as one of the elements of this. And again, when there'll be a state commission of review, that will inevitably be part of what is discussed and what emerges in that inquiry.
Right. Okay. What then is going to happen in Gaza? What is the goal on the part of the Israeli military? What is the end game? Is there an end game? If they are in fact able to get rid of Hamas or a substantial portion of it, what then?
My guess of where the Israelis are right now is they haven't yet defined the end game. They will have to, for sure. They are operating on the premise that we will not again subject ourselves to Hamas's ability to threaten us. Now, the implication of that is that Hamas is going to be removed. Now, saying you're going to remove Hamas and being able to achieve it are not necessarily the same things. What for sure will be the aim of the military operation, and it will be on the ground at some point. What is happening now is a kind of softening up. The bombing is going after every target they know of Hamas in terms of their military infrastructure, where the bomb-making labs are, where the rockets might be, where the command posts are, where the bulk of the fighters could be. You know, you can't in the end root it out from the air, but you can soften what is the landscape of the battle that you're going to have to fight, and that's what's going on. And it's not at all clear, when the Israelis will decide there's been enough of this. So that's sort of point one. Point two is, for sure, there will be an objective of destroying the military infrastructure. There will also be an objective of trying to decapitate Hamas and its leadership. Now, all of this will be daunting because of the nature of Gaza, because of the density of the population, because of the ability to find where these guys are hiding. The command posts typically are under hospitals and under mosques, in tunnels, connected, in highly populated, dense areas. Sometimes, one of the things UNRWA found several times that there were command posts and tunnels under schools. So this is the environment that Israel is going to be operating in. If you are trying to remove Hamas, then you also have to replace it with something. Israel is going back, and what was off the table for a long time was reoccupying Gaza. It's no longer off the table. They may well be reoccupying Gaza, but if you reoccupy Gaza, you don't want to stay there. It wasn't an accident that Israel was out. It wasn't an accident that there wasn't a groundswell across Israel to go back into Gaza. No one wants to be there. So if you go back in, you also have to have a way out. My expectation is Israel will begin to talk about quietly with us about either the Palestinian Authority comes back in, which, by the way, they will not want to come in on the back of Israeli tanks. So what you really have to think about is, can you create some kind of international mechanism, some kind of transition authority for Gaza? And it could be wedded to a reconstruction plan. It could be wedded to some kind of interim administration with people, technical people, technicians, specialists, Palestinians in Gaza, maybe from the West Bank as well. You could also set up a plan for elections after 6 to 9 months. But you're going to need something like that. I've just written an article where I was calling for, with everything that's going on, you need a day after plan. And the time for a day after plan to develop it isn't the day after. You need to do it in advance. We should be talking to, can the Egyptians play a role here? The answer is yes, they can, but not by themselves. They won't want to be by themselves. You'll need to have others, maybe some Europeans. You have to think hard about, is Turkey a possible player here as well? The relationship they have had with Hamas will create some suspicions there. Some will raise Qatar, and Qatar is absolutely excluded, because Qatar right now is home to Ismail Haniyeh, Khalid Mashal.
Yeah. So can you explain that? Because Qatar is also an ally to the United States. And so how is it that Qatar is supplying $1 billion a year to Hamas and the United States and Israel are okay with that?
Well, here again, I'll divide it in two. look, part of keeping Gaza calm was the money that Qatar was providing to Hamas in Gaza. As I said, the Israelis interpreted some of these demonstrations along the wall as a way of getting Qatar that had cut the money to restore the money, if not to add to it. So one thing was trying to keep things calm based on the money from Qatar. But the second thing is that Qatar sort of sees itself as this bridge between the Islamists and the Western world and us. The problem, it's one thing to be a bridge. I used to complain they're kind of a bridge to nowhere. If you are rationalizing and legitimizing these groups, you're not a bridge. Right now, you have Haniyeh there, and he's out there spewing his poison, justifying what they've done. Al Jazeera right now, if you look at Al Jazeera, it is focused exclusively on dead Palestinians and haven't said word one about what Hamas did in Israel. So, there will be those, including, by the way, to be fair, there will be Israelis who say, look, you can't cut off Qatar because for the day after, they may have a role to play. It won't be in terms of being in Gaza, but it might be in terms of monies they provide to help with a serious reconstruction program, to help with the enforcement mechanisms to ensure you have full disarmament and there can't be rearmament. But to have them be part of the administration, I don't see that. Egypt, Turkey's a possibility. You could look at some Europeans as well. There needs to be a kind of plan for an interim administration. It needs to draw on Palestinians from within Gaza, creating those, and there are highly skilled people who could play a role here. And we should be thinking about that. It could be a transition to bring the Palestinian Authority back into Gaza. But honestly, I would like to see reform on the Palestinian Authority side. If you're going to be talking about the kind of transparency and reforms you need for a major reconstruction project and plans within Gaza, and you want the PA to play a role, there should be comparable transparency in the West Bank, because actually some of the reconstruction could be done in the West Bank as well, but not unless they reform themselves. And we should be thinking in broad terms about of also restoring some of the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank.
But how is that going to be acceptable to the majority of Gazans who will emerge from this seeing most of their area destroyed, thousands upon thousands of people killed, including, most of them civilians and lots of children,
Right.
Half the population in Gaza are children. And how is that not going to prevent another generation of really, really angry people who are furious at Israel and the United States and who would install another Hamas-like entity to govern there?
Look, it's a very fair question. But I think one thing to bear in mind, Hamas is not popular in Gaza. There was a poll just before this started that showed that 62% of the Gazans wanted Hamas not to break ceasefires. Okay, right before this, 62%. There was and it's really worth seeing, something called Whispers in Gaza, which was an animated set of videos interviewing people who live in Gaza, voices distorted so that they wouldn't be killed by Hamas. And there were a series of them going through what life is like in Gaza, including one former prominent figure in Hamas who was completely fed up with what they've done in Gaza. It got 750,000 views in Gaza. Don't think that when people emerge from this, they're going to come out and they're going to be applauding Hamas. There's a lot of anger. You're right. There'll be anger at Israel for sure. There'll be anger at us because we support Israel. But don't mistake the fact that there'll be a lot of anger towards Hamas. People didn't want this. Hamas chose this. They protect themselves, but they don't protect anybody there. That's why it's so important not to let time go by. I often say in good statecraft, when you have moments, You have to seize those moments. If you don't seize the moment, you're always worse off than if you didn't have the moment at all. In the immediate aftermath, there has to be such a serious effort at reconstruction to show that the world is responding, but it's in the context where Hamas isn't there. And in that sense, then you see others delivering. Hamas has delivered misery for Palestinians in Gaza. And we need to show there's an alternative that offers a future and a sense of possibility. Think about one of the interesting things I said before. Even Hamas understood it was in their interest to have more and more Gazans working in Israel. Israel was letting more come in. They were up to 20,000, but there were many more who wanted to come in. So you have an interesting reality that they knew how bad life was, and they wanted something better.
Is there a universe in which Israel lifts the blockade of Gaza? After
Yes,
all?
there is a universe in which they do, in which Hamas is not in power, in which you have monitoring mechanisms for everything that comes in, including on all dual use items, in which you actually have, say, an international and interim administration in Gaza, where they're actually committed to reconstruction, as opposed to what Hamas has been committed to. One of the things about Hamas, they built an underground city in Gaza, using enormous amounts of cement, wood, steel, copper, electric wiring. All of this was to protect them, not their public. All of that could have been used above ground, but it wasn't. So, suddenly to have a major effort at reconstruction and to show a kind of responsiveness, this can make a difference. If it doesn't happen, then you continue to have people wallow in a sense of hopelessness, and there will be others who will come in to claim the mantle. But the level of destruction will be unprecedented. It won't just be the number of deaths, it'll be the level of destruction as well. So the need for reconstruction will be overwhelming. And again, Hamas has rejected the idea of this demilitarization for reconstruction, because they put militarization, fighting Israel, not reconstruction of Gaza, as their priority.
What is your estimate for the amount of deaths and what the destruction will look like?
Well, the destruction is not hard to imagine in terms of the buildings, the roads. The scope of this will be pretty staggering. The Israelis identified 7 areas where they were telling Palestinians to go. They put out the message in Arabic for where to go. I would like to see them build up the means for providing humanitarian assistance to those. That will reduce the number of deaths, but it's going to be hard. I talked to a friend of mine in Gaza who was there, has already had 15 members of her family killed. And she said, look, we know where the Israelis want us to go, but we can't go because she has 90-year-old parents. She said, we're not movable. This is a tragedy of unbelievable proportions. But who's responsible for it? Hamas is responsible for it. So I don't want to predict the number of deaths, but they're going to be high. There are ways, as I said, to try to reduce them, and I hope that is done. But Israel is not going to live again with this threat from Hamas. The idea for 14 years of accepting this kind of a reality, that's gone. That's not going to happen. As I said earlier, you can talk to the most left-wing Israelis, you can talk to the most pro-peace Israelis, you can talk to those Israelis who want to make the most far-reaching concessions to Palestinians. They feel just as strongly about this as others who don't have those attitudes.
But you liken this to our 9/11 or worse.
Yeah.
And of course, to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we saw how that turned out for the United States.
Yep.
So when you look at that as a lesson, what do you draw from that in terms of what Israel needs to not do to avoid a similar fate that befell the United States in those 2 arenas?
What's different in these cases is this is right next door to Israel. Iraq and Afghanistan weren't right next door to us. The sense of kind of the existential nature of this, how it affects your daily life, is completely different from what we faced. So number one, that's why there's a kind of consensus. And I would say a readiness to pay a very high price. It's not just the Palestinians are going to pay a high price. The IDF is going to pay a very high price. So that's different to begin with. Secondly, I understand. I mean, people who I have a lot in common with are raising concerns about Hamas wants Israel to come in and get bogged down. But they don't offer a pathway for Israel is other than living with Hamas next door. And Israel's not going to do that. And so I think the notion here that Hamas wants them to do it. First, I don't think so. I think ironically, Hamas thought by taking all these hostages, Israel wouldn't do this, that they would deter Israel, because they looked at, Prime Minister Netanyahu traded over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, many who were responsible for bombings in Israel, lots of blood on their hands, for Gilad Shalit, one soldier. Their view was, we'll take all these hostages and this will stop the Israelis, this will protect us. And that's a miscalculation. It's not that Israel isn't sensitive to it. It's not that you won't see some effort at rescue. But at the end of the day, as excruciating as some of the choices the Israeli leadership is going to have to make, and these will be excruciating, they are going to deal with Hamas in a way that Hamas cannot be a threat again.
So what I'm understanding you saying is, if it's a choice between not going in and maybe
living with Hamas
hostages,
yeah,
they're willing to risk the lives of the hostages.
As
Rid of Hamas.
Callous, yes, as callous as that is, the calculation is just different than it's been before. And it's awful. It is. It's awful. It's awful for Israelis. It's awful for Palestinians. But you're confronted with this deep dilemma. And the idea that at the end of this, Hamas is still there, and Hamas, if they're still there, are going to claim victory. And if they can claim victory, it has an impact on the region as a whole. You need to have Hamas seen as decisively defeated, because it's not just Hamas you're defeating an ideology of rejectionism that, if it looks like it's successful, then has an appeal to much broader publics in the region. And it forestalls any ability to move towards greater normalization. When I talk about the day after, I'm not just talking about the day after in Gaza. I believe, ironically, that the Saudis are still interested in having the normalization breakthrough with Israel, in part because of what they get from us. I would say in large part because of what they get from us, but also because they see a relationship with Israel as being of some benefit to them. Now, all of that's put on hold right now, but one of the components of that was a Palestinian component, something you do for Palestinians as well. And I had argued for, you have two headings here. One is you improve the day-to-day realities for Palestinians in terms of movement, accessibility to water, infrastructure development, and taking tangible steps on the ground so that you preserve two states as an option. Those are the kind of things that appeal to the Saudis and would be part of this package. Well, if you can do what we're describing in Gaza and can do what I'm talking about now, you put everything on a different trajectory. And it's not impossible, but it requires an unmistakable defeat of Hamas. So you can define that in a lot of ways. Maybe it's not the removal of Hamas, but it's clearly Hamas's loss of power, his ability to do anything, and probably even changing something in Gaza. And there may be different vehicles here, but if you destroy their military wherewithal, you put them in a position where they're dramatically weaker. And then the narrative becomes, look what they did. They brought catastrophe to themselves and basically destroyed themselves as a real viable force.
But that can't be done without a ground war, is what you said.
It will not happen without it. Look, it doesn't matter. My analysis is not the key here. The reality of 100,000 Israeli troops on the border with Gaza is creating a new reality. The determination to remove Hamas as ever being a threat again, you cannot do that only from the air. So it's not an analysis, it's the case of what are the facts.
What is the purpose of the U.S. Aircraft carrier doing there? Why is that there?
It is, we moved what is the Ford, which is our most modern carrier. It's a carrier strike force. I want to explain what that is. When I say a carrier strike force, it's not just a carrier. The carrier goes with a number of other ships with it. So there are 2 destroyers, there are cruisers. The destroyers and the cruisers have Aegis anti-missile capabilities. They have extensive intelligence gathering capabilities. They have 72 aircraft. Now, this is a really formidable show of force. And I think the message when President Biden said, anyone who's thinking about taking advantage of this, he had one word for them: don't. This is a message to Hezbollah and Iran: don't expand this. Now, will they test that? Right now, my sense is Hezbollah is trying to play a game of showing that they're heating things up along the border. There are some, there's some missiles being fired, but they're all highly localized right around the border. Hezbollah is signaling, we don't want this to expand, but we're going to do something. The Israelis have an interest in not turning this into a multi-front war if they can avoid it. But I want to be clear, they're ready for it. They are ready for it. When people think about Iran, they think, okay, Iran just wants to push this and make it as bad as possible for Israel. Make it a multi-front war. Have Hezbollah come in, and Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets. Let there be an uprising in the West Bank. Have Israeli Arabs, disrupt things. They want the maximum here. Hezbollah understands the Shia base in Lebanon does not want a war, and they'll be the ones who pay the price for war. So Nasrallah has to decide: does he do what the Iranians want, or does he keep this contained? And to be fair, the Iranians have always looked at Hezbollah as a kind of reserve force. One of the things I think is quite telling: a week ago, the Supreme Leader gave a speech in which he said that normalization was a threat, and that those who carried out normalization would pay a price. Now, was this an early warning of what Hamas was going to do? No, I think it was just targeted on the fact that there is all this speculation about a breakthrough between Saudi Arabia and Israel. The Iran, I think, after the Supreme Leader having said that, who was the first to come out and say they weren't responsible for what happened? Iran. What does that tell you? It tells you they were suddenly afraid. they put one and one together and said, gee, the Supreme Leader said this. They might think we did it, and they wanted to immediately disown it. Now, they were celebrating it at the same time, but they claimed we didn't do it.
Do you believe them?
I believe they didn't do it for reasons I said. I don't think that I think, look, they're promoting Hamas, they're arming Hamas, they're financing Hamas, they're pushing Hamas and Hezbollah together. They're encouraging Hamas to kill as many Israelis as all the time, trying to stoke things up in the West Bank. But this was an operation that required complete secrecy. And again, you have to understand the level of Israeli penetration of Iran is quite remarkable. They ferreted out of Tehran, downtown Tehran, 55,000 documents, the whole nuclear archive. I mean, they go and they kill the chief nuclear scientist, a guy who had constant security with him. The guy in the Revolutionary Guard responsible, again, in Tehran for all overseas operations, was killed in Tehran. So their penetration of the Iranians is extensive. And if there was real discussions between Hamas and the Iranians, the Israelis would have picked it up. So I think, are they responsible in a general sense because they constantly push this, because this is their narrative, because this is who they arm and support? Yes. But were they directly responsible for orchestrating this? I don't buy it, because, as I said, for very practical reasons and operational security reasons, I think it would have been exposed.
Okay, wow, this hour is flying by. I could spend a lot more time with you, but I think this is the time when we go and read some of the questions from the audience. And Alan asks, can a corridor be created to allow Gazans, women and children, especially, to leave to Egypt? I guess it's not possible right now. The Rafah Gate has been bombed when Egypt has closed it. So is there a possibility for a humanitarian corridor?
There's a possibility for a humanitarian corridor in terms of getting humanitarian assistance in. Egypt does not want to have Palestinians from Gaza coming into Egypt. So, and Israel doesn't want to be seen as pushing Egypt to accept Palestinian refugees. That will complicate the Egyptian-Israeli relationship. But as I said, there are 7 areas in Gaza that the Israelis designated, tweeted in Arabic, sent out messages in Arabic to have the Palestinians go to those areas. I would like to see the Israelis facilitate humanitarian assistance going into these areas, because that will reduce the number of Palestinians, not only suffering, but the number of Palestinians who will get killed.
But can 2 million Palestinians go to these 7 areas?
Look, they will find it difficult, but you can reduce the number of people who are exposed. And that's anything you can do in that regard you want to do.
Should Israel allow for international humanitarian assistance to come in? And
At least I would like to see them allow corridors into them, or they can, the way you do it, you don't do it blanketly, you permit it during certain times of day. This is how you do it. There's plenty of experience with active conflicts where you create certain hours in the day where it's permitted, or you do a 12-hour period where it's permitted. The hesitancy is not to let Hamas operatives go infiltrate those areas, to use the respite to try to retool. But there's a balance of considerations here, and it's in Israel's interest to show they are fighting Hamas. They're not punishing the Palestinian people. That's an important distinction for them. They need to be framing it that way, and we should be framing it that way.
But when you cut off food, water, and electricity to the people, how are they not to see that this is Israel punishing civilians?
No, look, I mean, the Israelis are clearly trying to set a battlefield that makes it harder and harder for Hamas to sustain itself. Here again, you have dilemmas and you have to make some choices, and there are some balances that have to be struck. There is, like, you can't starve people into submission, and ultimately they won't.
I'm not sure if we answered this, but Alan asks, how long will this operation take? Any ballpark?
It depends. Look, the one thing I said, if there's a second front with Hezbollah, this is going to be much longer, given the character of what Hezbollah can do. I think we're looking at least a month, maybe a month or 2. We shouldn't have any illusions. Going in is going to be very hard. All the people who say that, don't create your own Fallujah. It would be fine if we were 6,000 miles away from Fallujah, the Israelis were. But unfortunately, this is right next door. That's what I think some people are overlooking.
Lisa asks, what course would you advise Israeli diplomats to follow?
Well, I would start by publicly, first, you tell the story of what's happened, which they've done a pretty good job of exposing what's been done. But I think number 2, they have to make this point I was just saying. This is about Hamas, not about the Palestinian people. Number 3, create these corridors into the safe areas, so they're showing they're doing something very directly here. 4, make it clear that in the aftermath of Hamas, they will support a massive reconstruction program for Gaza. Just take these 4 steps, and you can begin to affect the narrative and the story of what people are seeing. And they need to do it because the images are going to become more and more gruesome to see.
So we talked a lot about the end game on the part of the Israelis, but for Hamas, what is the end game? Why did they do this in the first place? And what are their possible goals other than to shore up their own power?
Look, right now, the only goal they have is survival. That's the only goal they have. And if they survive, they'll claim they won. That's their only mindset at this point. They would like Hezbollah to come in. They would like, fomenting trouble in the West Bank. So far, it's not happening, and that'll only deepen their sense that that survival is their only goal. Why do they do it? One, they have an ideology. People shouldn't miss this. I asked a question. I was asked the question the other day. If there was an active peace process, it wouldn't have happened, right? I said, wrong. In the 1990s, every time we made progress, we faced a Hamas bomb. Every time. Hamas did more than anyone to kill the peace process. The Second Intifada killed the peace camp in Israel. It's the very reality that there was the prospect of normalization with Saudi Arabia that created a huge motivator for them to act. The idea that Hamas and peace go together, they're a contradiction in terms. That's not an argument against trying to have peace or thinking that, when this is all over, you don't deal with the Palestinians as an issue. It is an issue that has to be dealt with. They're not going away. But the reality that if we just had a peace process, we wouldn't have to worry about Hamas, just the opposite. The greater progress you make on peace, the more Hamas has an incentive to do what it did, which is why they have to be seen as decisively losing. If there is any hope for the future, this is not just about Israel not facing a constant threat from Hamas next door. This is also about being in a position where you have a chance to change the trajectory and actually deal with the potential of peacemaking again.
I want to ask a final question, and that is the United States. Obviously, we saw Blinken today standing next to Netanyahu, issuing a strong statement. The president also gave a very strong speech the other day. What role does the United States have, aside from positioning the ship, as we discussed, and providing replacements to the Iron Dome and standing alongside leaders? Does it have a role on the other side as well? Maybe negotiating with Egypt to take in Palestinians, or I don't know what, but it used to be, and when you were in the Clinton, when you were negotiating with the administration, that the United States saw itself as a big power for bringing peace to this region. And that has obviously not been the case in many, many years. Do you think that this will reinvigorate the United States' position as wanting to take a more active role?
I think it's a reminder that when we don't, you see what the consequences are. I mean, look, I've said this for a long time. Back when Secretary Baker was, during the transition, he was the secretary designate, and I was doing briefings for him. And the first thing he said to me before I started the Middle Eastern briefing was, he said, "Dennis, I'm not going to do what George Shultz did and just fly around the region." He ended up doing dramatically more. And I said to him, "You may ignore the Middle East, but the Middle East won't ignore you." And this is, again, we're reminded we may be in a longer term competition with China. We are, but the part of that competition is an illusion. And we're seeing now, you have to view everything you do as part of what's happening on the global stage, and how does this fit in? And it does fit in, because this is a region that radiates trouble outward. It doesn't just keep it on the inside. For the next 25 to 30 years, fossil fuels will still be important. Why we transition away from them? You want to manage your economy. It's geographically, it's a kind of central point. So you have all sorts of reasons to be involved, and the consequence of not being involved is you end up having crises that suck you in anyway. And when that sucks you in, your options are always worse off than if you had been doing more in advance. Which is not to say, look, what is happening right now is not because the American administration wasn't active in the Middle East. What's happening now is that Hamas decided it was going to do this. But it is a reminder to us, we need to be building up those who represent the coalition that wants a very different future for the Middle East. What the Saudi-Israeli breakthrough promised was a network of states that are focused on building resilient economies, dealing with the challenges of the 21st century, versus a coalition of those that only know how to build failed entities, failed policies, and failed states. We need to be on the side of those who are going to build successful states, and that has to be part of our agenda.
Right. Well, thank you so much again for your time and your comments. Greatly appreciated. And hopefully we can talk again soon under better circumstances.
I hope so too. Thanks.
And thank you so much for joining us today. And don't forget to tune in next week for a conversation with Adam Nagorny of the New York Times. I'm Madeleine Brand, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.